Genesis, the Jewish Kingship. I'm going to do a double recording of this. Now, welcome everybody to Lessons to Come to Scandal, the Genesis of Jewish Kingship. So this is going to be a very unique class for those of you, all of you who have been coming to my classes for some time, and usually I take more of a lecture discussion approach in my topics. This is going to be much more based on the discussion that we're going to have together and coming to certain conclusions as a group. And what we're going to attempt to do in this class is to analyze different parts of the Torah, and through the analyzation that we come to, we're going to come to great conclusions about Jewish history, and specifically for this class, the issue of the monarchy within the Jewish people. And that is that we're going to be focusing essentially on the family of King David and where the family of King David comes from. Now, we're not going to be discussing King David himself in this class. That's beyond the scope of this discussion. We're going to be looking at the roots of King David as they are found long before he was born. And our discussion is going to start right at the beginning in the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit. Now, if we take the whole book of Genesis and we do a quick literary analysis of it, we'll see that in general there's two major stories. I mean, if we get through the beginning, which is, so to speak, the rough draft of the world, creation, Noah, the flood, we get to the second world, or the world as we know it with Abraham, and you essentially have two narratives. You have the story of Abraham, and you have the story of Joseph. Right? The crux of the book of Genesis is the story of Abraham and the story of Joseph. Now what's interesting is when you look at these two stories, both stories are interrupted with these interludes where the focus is put onto someone who at this point has been a minor character, and that minor character for a short time period becomes a major character, and then we go back to the regular story. So as approaching these stories from as literary analysis, we have to wonder what those stories are doing there. And the truth is, we'll find that those stories are really the roots of Jewish kingship. Those are the roots of Jewish kingship. And what I'm referring to are the stories of Lot and his daughters, and the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Now, just briefly, what is the story of Lot and his daughters? Well, we have the famous states or countries or cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, that are being destroyed. Lot, after leaving Abraham 15 years before, decides to settle in the land of Sodom. And through some reason that we're going to discuss, he is able to be saved from the land of Sodom. Two angels come into the city. He takes them in as guests in his house. The mob of people in Sodom come to try and get these angels, and eventually to try and violate these angels, because they think they're guests, and they don't like guests over there in Sodom. And eventually the angels reveal themselves as angels. They say, Lot, it's time to get out of here. Get your daughters, get your sons-in-laws, get your wife. We're going to get out of here. We're going to destroy the city. They take Lot, his daughters, and his wife by the hand. They run out of the city. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt. And just Lot and his daughters survive. That night up in a mountain, we have a situation where Lot and his daughters are sitting there thinking that they're the last people alive on earth. And the daughters decide that they have the task of repopulating the world, and therefore they come up with a scheme where they will get their father drunk, they will cohabitate with their father, and they both do this, the older one on the first night, the younger one on the second night. They both have children, and those children are known to us as Moab and Ammon, the nations of Moab and Ammon. They're mentioned many times in the Torah. That is, in a nutshell, the story of Lot. We're going to get to that in a minute. That story is going to be the focus of tonight's class and next week's class. And the story of Yehuda and Tamar we'll get to in the third session. Essentially, we have, after the selling of Joseph into slavery, we have Yehuda, who is blamed for the whole situation, who goes off, gets married, has two sons. The older son gets married, dies without children. Levirate marriage is performed with the younger son. He gets married, dies without children. The third son is left waiting for to grow up so he can marry Tamar, the daughter. Eventually the marriage never happens. Tamar dresses up as a harlot, cohabitates with Yehuda. has a baby, and that again leads to King David. That would be our discussion for the third class. But it's interesting that we have these, we have the regular stories going on of the book of Genesis. We have Abraham on one hand, we have Joseph on the other hand, and then we have these interludes, which are very similar. Both have a seduction story as part of them. And both situations, the woman is the one to initiate the seduction. Not only that, but in both situations, the women have high-minded motives as to what they're doing. It's not just a plain old seduction. There's actually very significant goals going on there. In both situations, the men are really in the dark, at least somewhat, as to what is going on. And in both situations, it's either an incest or quasi-incest going on. In both situations, 2 children are born. And what is interesting is the culmination of both situations is that we will eventually have one child from the union of Lot and his oldest daughter, that is Moab, who will eventually marry the child who is the descendant of Yehuda and Tamar, that is Peretz, and they will eventually marry in the form of Ruth and Boaz, who will eventually give way to King David. So it's interesting that these stories are so similar, and they are really, if you will, a triangle for the Jewish monarchy, with Lot and his daughters on one side, with Yehuda and Tamar on the other side, and they're going to come together with a point of Ruth at the top. So the first 2 classes we're going to focus on Lot and his daughters. The next 2 classes we're going to focus on Yehuda and Tamar, and then we're going to sum it all up with Ruth, and we're going to bring it all together to have to come to a certain understanding of the meaning of the kingship within the Jewish people. And I think we'll see certain themes develop that are very prevalent within the life of David and within the life of the Jewish monarchy. So that is essentially the goal of these classes that we're going to be joining together for the next few weeks. So we start tonight with the story of Lot and his daughters. Now, if we, everyone has a chumash in front of them, so I want everyone to, at any point in this class, please look at the verses and make your own points, make your own comments about what you see in the story. But I just want to give a little bit the picture of the whole story. And the story starts on page 78 or 79, chapter 18 in the book of Genesis, what we call Parshas Vayera. Now, the story starts with Lot's uncle, who was Abraham, or Avraham, just 3 days after he was circumcised. And we see that, and we find him sitting at the entrance to his tent, and our sages tell us that the reason he's sitting at the entrance of his tent is because he's waiting on guests. Avraham was a big machnes orchim, he was a big bringer in of guests, he always liked to have guests, and he was sitting there waiting for guests. And the story actually starts off with something very interesting, that if you look at the very first verse there, that God appears to Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance to his gate in the heat of the day. That's verse number 1. You see verse number 2, that Abraham raises his eyes and sees 3 men coming towards him. And he sees them and he runs to greet them from the entrance to his tent, and he bows down to the ground to his guest. Now, what's interesting about that introduction there? What was Abraham doing before he runs off to greet these angels? He doesn't know we're angels. He thinks they're men. What's he doing? He's talking to God, and he kind of puts God on hold to go out and greet these angels. A little bit of a peculiar situation there. You would think if you're talking to God, God should have precedence. And here we see that he runs off to go greet these angels. So Rashi actually tells us from there that we see that the Jewish trait of bringing in guests is even greater than greeting God himself. And that's what we learn from Abraham over there. Okay? So we have the whole situation here where Abraham asks the guests to come into his house. He has them wash their feet.